Welcome back to another edition of my GMEA All-State Performance Guide videos. My name is Scott Brown, and I am a private saxophone instructor in the Atlanta area, and I'm also the instructor of saxophone with the Decatur Fine Arts Academy. Today, you'll be hearing some performances of and tips for the Alto GMEA All-State Etudes. I hope these tips are helpful for you in your preparation. Without further ado, here is the first recording. For the middle school lyrical etude, there's a couple points to consider. The first of which is a general style point. There's a number of accents that occur throughout the course of this etude, and it's important to make sure that those are clear, but making sure that they fit within the style of this piece. Being that this is a lyrical etude, the whole etude should have this song-like quality to it, and so those accents need to be clear, but they can't be too pointed and too aggressive. And so play around with how you're getting those accents to respond. The next point is talking about the difference between triplet rhythms and dotted 8th plus 16th note rhythms. I talked about this difference in my tenor saxophone guide. I believe it was the middle school lyrical etude, and I would recommend looking at my comments there because they apply the same here. But in short, make sure that there's a difference between these two rhythms and that you properly subdivide them. Speaking of subdivision, there's one more important place to subdivide within this piece. In measure 8, when we had the ritardando, I would highly recommend subdividing the 16th note throughout the entirety of that measure. The reason being, if you rely on feel for a ritardando, it can not always feel and sound organic to the listener, and thus by subdividing the 16th note, you're going to have more control over how to pace that ritardando. The very first challenge for the middle school technical etude comes on the very first note. It's important to make sure we're using the right kind of air on that low C, as oftentimes air is the reason why it may not respond properly. A couple strategies that I would use are the following. First, I would try an air-only attack on the low C. In practicing it this way, you eliminate articulation from the equation, and thus you can truly figure out exactly what your air needs to do. And so just try using a ha attack in your practice a couple times until you get the response that we are looking for. Then, once you get that to happen, add the tongue back in, and if that's creating response issues, you're likely moving your tongue too much, and so try and mitigate the amount that your tongue is moving. And lastly, to make sure that our air is traveling fast enough, I would think about bracing my core muscles as we're playing this note. This will help ensure that we're sending our air super far with a fast air speed. The last element to consider with the technical etude is creating a breathing roadmap. There are already a number of breaths marked in, however, there's some more breaths that might need to be taken, or you may not need to take all these breath marks. This is unique to the individual. And so I would make sure to mark clearly where you're going to breathe and where it's possible for you to breathe. Sometimes I have optional breaths that I will decide in the moment if I need. And so having these options help take your mind off of thinking about where we need to breathe and can allow you to concentrate on other aspects of the etude. Contrast is critical for the concert band lyrical etude. We have some very soft softs and some very strong fortes that occur throughout the course of this etude. In order to make your soft playing a bit better at the beginning, I have a couple tips for you. The first of which is probably starting with an air attack in this etude. Now, we talked about air attacks as a way to help find the right air in the middle school etudes, but you can also use air attacks when you want to start with a pure sound and we don't want the articulation tongue sound to be in the sound. The other part to soft playing is actually thinking about taking in a little bit less mouthpiece than what we're normally going to play with. This way, we have to fight a little bit more resistance, but if you're using strong air with the right amount of air speed, then that allows us to have a more timid sound, but it still can respond in a beautiful way. So play around with how much mouthpiece we're taking in and make sure to experiment with some air attacks. My other piece of advice is to check in with the metronome often when you're preparing this. Since the metronome marking is given at the 8th note value, the tempo is a little bit slow for this etude. The tendency will be to want to rush when you're performing this. And so in your practice, make sure to practice with the 8th note subdivision, but also try practicing this at the dotted quarter note value as well. This will give you less information and will force you to develop your own sense of internal pulse. Also, be sure to check in with these trill plus grace note spots. This is definitely going to be a place where time could be an issue. I would recommend just having one element in at a time when you're practicing this. So perhaps start with neither the trill nor the grace notes, then add one in, then try exclusively with the other. Then once both of those can be performed with accuracy with the metronome, you can add the trill plus the grace note. Is by making sure that you write in your fingering choice into your music. Similarly to creating the breathing roadmap, by writing in your fingering choice, it alleviates space in your mind to think about other things while you're performing. Specifically within this etude, there's a number of places where we can use either A sharp fingering or either F sharp fingering. We don't always use our alternate F sharp fingering, but there's a number of spaces in this etude where I think it's the appropriate fingering choice. So make sure you try both fingerings and write in whichever choice you make. Remember that using your side A sharp or B flat fingering would be probably best whenever there's sort of stepwise motion, and using our bis fingering would be best whenever there's leaps. Of course, there are circumstances where this rule can be broken, but my best advice is to try both fingerings. As far as F sharp goes, whenever there's any sort of chromatic motion, that alternate F sharp fingering is going to be your best friend. And making sure that you hit the alternate F sharp key with your ring finger as opposed to other fingers. There's a couple of tricky articulation patterns that occur throughout the course of this etude, and so make sure to practice them outside of the context of the etude. And so practice them in scales and practice just one measure at a time to make sure that you're doing the right articulation pattern. To really achieve the risoluto or resolute character that the etude asks you for, I would highly recommend making sure that you pay attention to the contrast between the first and the second half of this etude. When we get to measure 9 with the piano marking, make sure that it's soft, of course, but it is soft and still maintains intensity so that we push towards the very exciting ending of this etude. The symphonic band Lyrical Etude offers a lot of places for you to demonstrate your expressive abilities. One tool I can offer you to help create more sensitivity in your playing is by using side D and side E flat fingerings. We can use combinations of our palm keys without the octave key to get the middle D and the middle E flat to respond similarly to notes like our middle C. Oftentimes, as we're using a lot more fingerings for our middle D and middle E flat fingering, there can be a big shift in how those notes sound. And so by using palm key fingerings, we can bridge that gap and we can have a more blended sound. When I'm using my side D fingering, I just use my palm key E flat to get that note to respond. As intonation can differ greatly in the palm keys on different instruments, I would highly encourage you to check out a number of different combinations of palm keys and left hand buttons to get these different side fingerings to respond. There's a number of staccato markings within this etude. Make sure that these staccato markings fit within the style of the etude. The tendency will actually be to play these staccato markings too short, what will give the illusion of the contrast between a staccato and a normal articulated note is by making sure that these longer notes have more of this sostenuto or sustained sound. For instance, in the first measure, playing it more so like dum, 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 da, dee, as opposed to dum, 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 da, dee. The second way is a bit too choppy, and so try and have continuity with your articulation to an extent. One last thought. In measure 4, we have staccato markings under a slur. That is a conflict of interest. However, there's a name for what this is called. This is called a portato. In a portato, you will articulate those notes, but they'll be more fluffy, bouncy staccato notes. So make sure that you are articulating those lightly. There's a lot of notes in the symphonic band technical etude, but don't be intimidated. These are a lot of familiar patterns with arpeggios and scales that we've already prepared for this audition. So whenever you see a scale or arpeggio that we recognize, write in what it is into your music. You would be surprised with how much that actually helps you think less to play that chunk. In measures 10 and 11, we have a composite line going on. There are the repeated middle Cs, and then there's the chromatic line that ascends and then descends. The chromatic line is the more interesting line, so make sure that you're phrasing through that line. Make sure that you're focusing on the response of these notes, as these are the ones that are also going to be harder to respond. In measure 15, on beat 2, we can do what's called posting on the low B. To prepare for that low B, we can leave our pinky down on the low B key, starting on the E on beat 2. By doing this, we're already efficient by having our pinky in place, and we can help get that response of that low B to happen because one less of our fingers has to move. If you've gotten this far in the video, thank you so much for listening to my performances and my tips. I hope this guide was helpful for you. And if you have any further questions, feel free to drop a comment below or to shoot me an email, which I've listed in the description of this video. And if you're interested in getting a lesson with me, feel free to reach out via email as well. Thank you so much, and best of luck to you in your audition.